He is the newest member of our faculty at UNBC in the Ecosystem Science and Management program. Ché has just started this fall taking up the chair in Mixedwood Ecology and Management, which is an endowed chair with a history back to an investment made by West Fraser Timber and the Forest Renewal BC back, it would be like 15 years ago or so now. And that was a position previously occupied by Dr. Chris Hawkins, who is now the Vice President of Research at Yukon College up in Whitehorse. And it had been vacant for 2 or 3 years. So we were really glad to have this niche filled by Ché. So Dr. Elkin is originally from Moose Jaw, Saskatchewan, and he did his undergraduate work at the University of Regina, then did graduate work at the University of Toronto, went on to do postdoctoral work at University of Queensland, I believe it was, and then most recently has been working as a researcher in Switzerland. And so we're really glad to get him back to Canada and to exploring topics of complex forests in northern British Columbia. And after our little talk here, and after we get some lunch, and after I make a brief appearance to the Senate Finance Committee, I'm sorry I have to delay our field trip a little bit, Ché. We're gonna go off and look at some woods down the road ourselves. Take it away, Ché.
All right, thank you very much. So yeah, as Phil gave a very nice introduction to me, let me just say that I am an ecologist, and I've tried to direct this talk towards people that are possibly non-ecologists. If I go off on a tangent that seems a bit too esoteric or you have no idea what I'm talking about, please stop me, ask me some questions. No problems breaking up the talk here. So as was mentioned, I actually originally did my PhD work in Calgary on mountain pine beetles, then spent a little bit of time in Australia, and most recently in Switzerland. And I just want to spend a couple seconds talking about that work, because what I'm actually going to be talking to you about today is some of the insights that we've gained about mixed species forests from that work. And one of the things I'm going to try to do is say, is any of the insights that we've learned from Central Europe applicable to northern BC forests that we have here? They may be, they may not. You can actually debate with me about that. But this is kind of the typical area that I was working in the past, mountainous Central European. There's one thing that I really want you to take away from this photo here, which is a bit hard to see, but these are forests that are comprised of both deciduous and conifers. So we do have this big mixture of species. All through Europe, it's actually not that species rich in terms of species. There's only about 30 main species. But when we're trying to understand how these forests develop, looking at those interactions between the conifers and the deciduous is an important component. Now, when we're thinking about forests, one of the kind of most basic questions that we often ask is, why do you see species A here, species B here? So in northern BC context, why do we see aspen in some areas on the landscape? Why do we see spruce? Now, obviously, from a very basic level, that's just because you have site differences. Some sites are going to be much better for deciduous growth. Some sites are going to be much better for conifer growth. Species differences as well as the environment that they're growing on. Now, historically, whether or not you have a deciduous dominated stand or a conifer dominated stand has also thought to be very dependent on when you're looking at. So these things don't only vary in space based on where you have a good area for conifers or deciduous, but also they're predicted to change through time, or this has basically been the hypothesis for how these stands can change through time, is they go through a successional stages. The idea being that after a large, intense disturbance, be it an intense fire that kind of gets rid of everything, or a clear cut, you're left with a situation where you have lots of light on the ground. The deciduous species that really love these lots of light conditions can come in there, they can grow quickly, and you start off with a stand that is dominated by hardwood species. As that stand starts to age, those trees grow up, they're starting to create more shading on the ground, create a situation where you can get regeneration of some of the more light intolerant conifer species. They're going to start to grow up there. You're going to have mortality events for some of the deciduous. And if you go right down to the end, you're into a forest type where you're kind of dominated by the conifers. This would be like the classic successional trajectory that we may expect going from hardwood to softwood over time. Where at any point along here, if you have one of these large-scale disturbance events, you're going to kind of reset the system back to its original state. Okay? So if we ask the question of why we see the certain species composition, it's not only going to be stand or site conditions, it's also going to be where along these trajectories we may be looking at. Now this is kind of a very simplified view of that. The way that we often view it these days is a bit more complex, saying that, well, the trajectory that different stands or different landscapes will take will really depend on a range of different things. And it's not a simple linear trajectory. It can go to different final states depending on what happens in the middle here. So one of the important things is you would expect the trajectory that it starts off on to really depend on what regenerates to begin with. If you just have stands that regenerate with deciduous species only, then it can continue up, where you may, if there's no regeneration of conifers, end up in a situation where you've got a pure deciduous stand. Alternatively, if you've got the conifers coming in here, you can go through all these various different dynamics. So the point being here, just that what we actually see on the ground will depend on what type of trajectory that stand, that forest has gone through. Now, our current understanding is that the main factors influencing how those forests will develop in the boreal and subboreal region is due to four main things. So we can have the intensity and frequency of primary disturbances. So these primary disturbances would be really intense landscape level fires that would wipe out all the forest and really reset the system. So the intensity of that and the frequency of that will depend on the trajectory. Site conditions, moisture conditions, nutrient conditions, that's going to be highly important. Whether or not you have regeneration of different species, if you don't have any trees around that are providing seeds or suckers, then that's obviously going to influence what type of species can regenerate. And finally, the presence of secondary disturbances, such as defoliators for the deciduous species, that's going to influence how those various different stands change through time. So we can say that based on current understanding, these are some of the main factors. Now, the thing that we need to map onto that, though, is that all these processes are also expected to be dependent on regional climate, driving both like disturbance regimes, influencing site conditions, influence regeneration and secondary disturbances, and obviously also dependent on forest management. Now, with that type of framework, the questions that I'm interested in and that I have been looking at and will continue to look at here are questions looking at how these forests are projected to change in the future due to a range of different drivers. So, for example, how will climate change influence forest dynamics, particularly these really complex dynamics as we make the transition from deciduous to conifer species and the type of pathways that those stands take? What type of impact will these shifts have on forest ecosystem services? So we can think about how forest dynamics will be impacted, but what about the services that we actually derive from those forests? How will they be modified?
Can you explain what that is? Ecosystem services?
Ecosystem services, sure. I'll actually get into that a little bit more, but just
Okay.
we can think about why do we want to have forest on the landscape? Timber. Everyone likes timber, that's great. Carbon storage. Everyone likes carbon storage sometimes, that's also great. But we also get other things such as biodiversity maintenance. There's recreational opportunities that we use in use our forests for. So it's just a range of different values that we derive from our forests. Now, the main thing of talking about ecosystem services is trying to move beyond the point of view that forests only do one thing. But there's actually a range of things that forests provide to us. And how they provide it, when they provide it, is going to be dependent on both the ecology, the management, but also what our demands are going to change through time as well. And then we can think about how forests can be managed to both maintain the forest, but also maintain those ecosystem services. Now, what I'm going to be doing in my talk today is really going over some of the past research that I have done primarily within a Central European context. And again, trying to give you some of the big take-home messages from that work and saying how that may relate to conditions in northern BC. Now, none of what I'm saying here should be taken as being a prescriptive statement of what's going to happen or what we should do in northern BC forests. However, what I'd like you to instead view it as is putting up flags for things that we should be thoughtful of and mindful of for how forests in this region are going to develop in the future. So basically the uncertainty that we possibly have with respect to how these forests will change. So what I'm going to start off with is just talking about some of the ways that we can actually explore forest dynamics, or more specifically the way that I have been exploring forest dynamics in my research. I'll then talk about some of the climate impacts we've seen in some forest systems, how forest disturbances may be expected to change in the future and interact with climate drivers, how forest ecosystem services may be shifted, and what we need to think about when we think about doing adaptive management. Okay? So, in terms of trying to understand forest systems, one of the ways that we can do that is by actually going through and creating dynamic forest models. Now, a dynamic forest model is simply a way of trying to represent the key processes that drive forest development using mathematical representation. So what we want to try to do is build in the things that we think are going to be really important for forest development. That's going to be tree recruitment. That's going to be the growth of trees under different conditions. That's going to be how different species compete. And that's going to be factors that influence tree mortality. So what we do is we build up a mathematical framework for this. We say that we want to simulate a stand or a little group of trees, and we're going to start off our simulation by saying that we've got this little stand here where we've got a bunch of regeneration taking place. We then know that those trees are going to grow up, and that they're going to grow up into bigger trees, and they're going to start competing with each other. As they start to compete, some species are going to die off. They're going to be competing for these limiting resources such as light, moisture, nutrients. And over time, you're going to get the stand developed into one where you have mature trees on it. You've actually gone through the successional pathway that I've talked about before. So these models can be used for a couple things, but one of the main benefits of using this type of framework is that if we don't understand the underlying ecology, we know our models are going to be wrong. So if we go through, project how the system is going to change and say, well, that model is just doing something that's completely wrong, we know inherently that our understanding or what we built into that model is wrong. So they're a very powerful way of testing ecological theory. The other thing that can be done with this is because it is mechanistic and you actually hopefully have captured the important processes, is you can project how the system will change if you push it into conditions that you don't observe right now. So for example, if you go into future climate scenarios or if you go into future management scenarios that aren't currently being practiced right now. So they're a valuable tool for that. Now, while they're a valuable tool, there's also constraints. Obviously, we are just representing basic biological processes with, in some ways, very simplified mathematical representations of it. So here we can think about, we want to just estimate how something like tree growth is going to occur. There, we say tree biomass in terms of tons, the actual weight of the tree is going to increase as it grows through the various different years. Now we can get a fairly simple model to do that, which is based on just two parameters, which we can actually go out into the field and measure. One being the maximum size that the tree can actually obtain under great growing conditions. So we go out there, measure a bunch of trees, say for this species, this is the maximum size that the tree can obtain. And we can also get the maximum growth rate. So if the tree is growing under great conditions, this is the growth rate, and represent growth like that. Now that's good because we've got a very simple model for growth that's dependent on two things that we can actually directly measure in the field, which we need to do. But a question arises, is the actual framework that we're using for representing growth appropriate? Now one thing that I've done in the past is ask the question of, if we actually use a different mathematical representation for that, basically doing the same thing, but just a different formulation, do we drastically change our projections? So here, we've got three different models. Don't worry about the maths at all. The thing that I just like to notice is that they all basically have the same growth form. This type of sigmoidal growth form where the trees start growing, they stay small for a while, and they jump up in size, and then when they approach their maximum size, growth rate starts to taper off. So all showing the exact same response, just slightly different in how it's represented. Now, if you do that, and you then say, okay, I'm going to simulate an area, or I'm going to use this model to project how forest dynamics look, you can ask how different are the actual forests that we're observing. So here, these are results for work that I did where we're trying to look at the forest composition in Central Europe in an area where we had this test landscape that went from about 600 meters above sea level to 2,200 meters above sea level. And what we're seeing on the y-axis here is the actual biomass of different species, which are shown up here. And the key thing that I'd like you to pick out, I'm sorry, just before I get into that, and we've got the 3 different models here. Don't worry about what the models are. The top one's the base one, and then there's these other 2 that I compared. The thing that I'd like you to notice is that at this intermediate elevations from about 1,200 meters up to 2,000 meters, all the models basically do the same thing. They all say Norway spruce, Picea aves, is going to be the dominant species there. That's great. Everything's fine. The model is very robust to the type of growth function that we're using. Conversely, when we look at these lower elevations from, let's say, 700 up to 1,000 meters, that's where we have a bunch of different species interacting, primarily deciduous species, and that's where we start to see differences. You can't really see it in these figures here, but if we look at these difference figures, which is just the difference in the species-specific biomass of the second model compared to the first model, and the third model compared to the first model, we see that there's actually very big differences in the species-specific projections at these lower elevations. At these higher elevations, that's dominated by spruce, not much of an issue. So what I'd like you to take away from this, or what I think we should take away from this, is that looking at these mixed species systems is actually very complex. Getting forest dynamics can be simple if you have only single species growing in one type of condition and one age structure. Once you're into the area where you're trying to project the interactions between multiple species, it can get much more difficult. Okay? Now, the first thing that I'll show you in terms of some of the actual work that we did was trying to project climate impacts on forests. And the example that I'll show here is work that we did in southern Switzerland in an area called the Valais, where there's an industrial center called Visp in the base here. And this area is interesting because over the past 30 years, there's been an observed dieback of Scots pine at lower elevations. The thought being that there's been an increase in drought stress over that period and an increase in mistletoe, which has resulted in the trees dying back. Now, because people in the area have noticed this fairly substantial change in the forest composition, the question that they have is, well, what's going to happen in the future? What's this forest going to look like in 2050, 2060, if these changes are already observed? So what we can do is, using that type of framework that I've just been talking about, is simulate not only individual stands, but simulate what the forest landscape is going to look like, and ask how that forest landscape is going to change over time if you do have an increase in temperature, a decrease in precipitation, which is what most of the climate models for this region are projecting. So that's exactly what I did. Simulated this valley here. And the important thing to note is this valley is really dominated by a very strong elevational gradient. Down at Visp, we're talking about 600 meters above sea level, up to about 2,200 meters at the top end here. And you can basically just view this as a fairly linear elevation gradient.
What's tree line there?
Tree line is very artificial. Everything at higher elevations has been mowed down for meadows. So if you're asking the question of what a natural tree line would be, about 2,300. Okay. Right now, it's probably more around 2,000 due to management. But when we're looking at this part of the valley here, that's where you're up in that area where, yeah, you're approaching tree line. It may not be natural tree line, but you are getting up in the higher elevations where trees are having a bit tougher time of it. So we can look at how just a very simple metric of above ground forest biomass is projected to change from 2000 to 2100. And this is using a moderate to extreme climate scenario from the IPCC 2007 assessment. A2, if anyone's familiar with those various different climate projections. And what it is projecting is about a 4-degree increase in temperature and about a 15% reduction in precipitation, if I remember correctly. Now, the key thing that I'd like you to take away from this is that when we look at how this forest is going to change through time, it's actually quite heterogeneous over this small landscape. At these lower elevations, where there's already been observed a decrease in forest biomass for the past 30 years, there's projecting to be quite a strong decrease in forest biomass. At these upper elevation sites, getting close to tree line, right now, tree growth is really limited to cold temperatures. So an increased temperatures actually projects that these forests are going to get more robust. So the take home that we can say, is there any insight that we can have from this work into northern BC, is that we really need to be cognizant of fairly small landscape level differences. There's no way that we could look at even this very small valley, it's only 5 kilometers by 10 kilometers, and give one simplified assessment for how this forest system is going to change through time. Some areas are going to are projected to have a decrease, some areas are projected to have an increase. Now, that's one way of looking at that data. Another way of looking at that data is looking through the whole time series, looking from the year 2000 to 2100, and looking at the projected shift in forest biomass across an elevation range. So here, blue and green represent areas where forest biomass is projected to increase compared to the same area in the year 2000. Orange and red is projected where it's to decrease. Now, this is just total forest biomass across all species. Obviously, the thing that jumps out at you is that there's this threshold value around 2050, 2060, where there's projected to be a fairly strong reduction in forest biomass at lower and intermediate elevations. Now, that's very important because I think this is one of the key things that we need to keep in mind. When we're looking or we're projecting forest changes through time, often due to species growth restrictions, species-specific thresholds, we may get to situations where this type of threshold response may be projected. Okay? So I would never argue that, of course, there is going to be a massive reduction in forest from 2050 to 2070. The model isn't that accurate, but what it really highlights is that we should be cognizant that we could be getting to these threshold values primarily for some species like Norway spruce. So the other thing that we can take away from this is if we break this down into a species-specific type of responses, it's the spruce that's really showing the large dieback around 2050, 2060 at those lower to intermediate elevations. And here, it really is lack of water. They're getting to a state where they don't have enough water, increased mortality, much lower recruitment is being projected for Norway spruce. For other species, such as Pinus sylvestris, there the projections are, even right now, there's going to be a start to the dieback of these species. And that does correspond to what's actually being observed on the ground. For other things like Quercus, which is a more drought-tolerant oak, there, again, a reduction around that 2060 mark. But the key thing being that we may or we need to keep into mind that often the biological processes that drive the various dynamics of these forests will inherently contain these threshold points that if they're crossed, we may expect to see a rapid change in the system. Okay?
Has this mathematical calculation and projections taken into consideration the concentration of carbon dioxide?
No. There's many different models of this framework that do have carbon dioxide built into them, but this specific one does not. So any type of carbon fertilization effect that we may expect is not included in this whatsoever. Now, I can somewhat justify that because at least for some of these higher elevation sites, the science really isn't set on whether or not that carbon fertilization is a true effect, and more specifically, is effect that will carry on for a long period of time. These trees may show increased growth for a 10, 20-year period, but whether or not they're able to maintain that increased growth under higher carbon levels for a longer period of time, there seems to be conflicting views that we're getting right now. So it's a little bit hard. Because it's not included in this, I can't really comment on what would happen if carbon fertilization is a key factor here.
You mentioned carbon fertilization. I was just wondering whether mild acid rain from carbon dioxide, carbonic acid, let's say, falling would change the soil chemistry?
It most definitely would. That is something that is not really a focus of much research right now. So although historically the type of inputs, the nutrient inputs and changes in nutrient inputs that have occurred in these forests have been a really major focus of research. But right now, the community that looks at these type of questions don't focus on that directly. So I'm not saying that it wouldn't be a factor, but in terms of the effect size or the projected effect size, it's not seen to be as a big thing. If we're talking about hydrological cycles, it may actually be much more important for that type of work.
you're talking about the total forest biomass there, that's based on those 4 species. There's no sort of research on the mesquite and the palm trees that are moving in?
Very good question. Yeah, these 4 species are the dominant species. I threw them up here. For these simulations, we have a set of 30 species that we use. Now, there's things that you have to be cautious of when you're doing that. No, we do not include the palm trees, the latifolium that are invading at the lower parts and the Ticino. They're not around here right now, and that if we threw them into the mix, we may see some strange behavior with them actually occurring in areas where they can't occur right now because they don't have the populations. So all the species that I was simulating with are the ones that are there right now or have the chance of getting in there in the relatively near future. So beech was included in this set. Now when I show this work to some of the people in the area, beech are probably about 30, 40 kilometers away. There's no populations right here. So they say, wow, there's no beech right here. There's no way that you could get beech. And we also have to qualify our statements with that. Because of that, I've actually done simulations with beech in and beech out of the data of the species set. And you do get differences, but the big take-home messages of these thresholds and looking at species responses are not there. But no palm trees in these simulations. Okay. That was obviously a very kind of small-scale case study in southern Switzerland. There's been other case studies that I've been working on that actually span a much broader environmental gradient. So work in Spain, Slovakia, Slovenia, and Bulgaria. And let's just ignore the Spain one right now. These 3 case studies are actually interesting because each of the case study is a forest dominated by Norway spruce. So all the same species functionally, with other species being in the mixture as well, but there's strong Norway spruce component to each of those forests. And if we look at how we may expect these forests to change in the future, obviously the changes that we expect are dependent on how close those spruce are to various different environmental thresholds. So down here in Bulgaria, they're really at the dry margin of their growth capability. So when we look at how those forests are projected to change in the future, the main drivers are an increase in the fire frequency, fire intensity, which is going to influence those forests or projected to influence those forests, and also just the drought having a direct negative impact on spruce growth. When we compare that to Slovakia and Slovenia, Slovakia forests are actually projected to do quite well, even under more extreme climate scenarios. In Slovenia, there's actually the main climate impact is being mediated through bark beetles. So Ips typographus, which is the European six-spine bark beetle, is currently a problem there, and it's really thought to be the main driving mechanism for loss of spruce in that region right now. Okay? So the key thing being here is the same point that I made before. When we're thinking about how forests will be impacted by climate change, regional differences obviously need to be taken into account. Okay? You can see that on a very small scale in Switzerland, but even on a broader European scale. Excuse me. And those comments on bark beetles lead into the next section that I want to talk about. And that is actually trying to figure out how forest disturbances will change through time and what type of impact forest disturbances will have on forest dynamics. Now, the type of disturbances that we were looking at was primarily changes in fire frequency and intensity, diseases, again, primarily bark beetles. This is something that's very important for Central Europe right now as well. Like I said, the six-spine European spruce bark beetle, but also wind and snow breakage occurring on the landscape scale. Now, what we can do to look at how these interactions take place is actually build in these type of landscape level disturbances into the same type of analytical framework that I've been discussing here with the forest dynamics as well. So we've got the forest dynamic projections that are in this component here, and we're going to build in these landscape level disturbances that themselves, if we're talking about fires and pathogens, are also or can be climate sensitive as well. And ask the question of how do these disturbances interact with climate and the dynamics that we're seeing in those forests to drive long-term forest state. Now, if we're asking the question of how does drought how does wind, disturbances, and beetles interact to influence forest dynamics, we can say that, well, if we're looking at a relatively small spatial scale, individual stand or a group of trees over a relatively short time span, let's say within a decade, we may be able to have a fairly good estimate for what those interactions are. This is where a lot of the research has been done. So if we know that there's going to be an increased drought on the small scale, that's likely going to have a negative impact on forest health. And here, just to explain the diagram here, solid lines are direct impacts, red being negative, green being positive. So if this direct negative impact on forest health through drought, that's likely going to have a positive influence on the beetles that's indirectly mediated. These type of interactions we probably have a fairly good handle on. There's been a lot of research done on how insects interact with various trees at different stress levels, so we're pretty confident about that. Even if we scale up to the landscape level on a relatively short time frame, we're still probably fairly confident about the nature of these interactions. Where it becomes much less clear is when we get to what the landscape level implications for much longer term time frames, say 50 years, 100 years in the future. There, whether or not this is a positive or negative direct influence and what that means for the actual beetle populations isn't something that we can actually easily tease apart. So one way to actually look at that is to, again, develop a modeling framework where those various different processes are explicitly included. And included in a way that you actually have the forest succession being simulated, you have bark beetle dynamics being simulated, and you have interactions between that, wind throw, with all these, some things such as forest susceptibility bark beetles and bark beetle pressure being influenced by climate as well. Okay? Now, let me just run through quickly what some of these components actually mean. So in terms of forest susceptibility, it's how likely is a forest to actually be attacked by this beetle, and how likely is that beetle to cause substantial damage. Now, from empirical work, we can actually draw fairly clear relationships for how that forest susceptibility changes as a function of things such as age, where for these spruce trees, between about 50 years and 100 years, there's a strong increase in the susceptibility of those trees to bark beetle damage. If we're looking at a stand level, the percent of spruce within a stand is a big determinant for whether or not you're likely going to see a bark beetle infestation occur. Wind throw, just to go into the biology a little bit, these beetles at low population densities can only attack really weakened trees. A great tree for them to reproduce in is a tree that has recently been blown down, so it's hard to get defensives going, but it still is full of a bunch of really tasty phloem that they can eat, grow, reproduce in. So great environment for them to reproduce in. Even though the relationship between wind throw and bark beetles is well known and people will say there's a positive relationship, trying to figure out what the actual functional form was extremely difficult for this work. Now, because of that, we just went back to simple first-order guess that we're going to use a linear relationship between wind throw and beetle susceptibility. So that's what we used. And the most important one is the relationship between tree stress and susceptibility. And here, tree stress is primarily driven just by drought stress. So as drought stress increases, these trees become much more susceptible to beetle infestations. Now, using this type of framework, we have the forest state be a function or be an influencer for how likely a beetle infestation is likely to occur, as well as something that is climate sensitive, which is the stress level of the trees. Now, that was the forest side. If you go on to the beetle side, there, the ability for the beetle populations to actually increase is also climate sensitive. For these populations, or for these beetles, the number of times that they can reproduce per year is highly temperature sensitive. So most populations, they'd be able to have 2 generations being produced per year, sometimes 1. If you warm up the climate, their reproductive success allows them to get 3, possibly even 4 generations out per year. So you've also got that direct climate driver on the beetle pressure. Excuse me. So, putting that all together into our modeling framework, we can project how these various different forests are going to change through time. And I'm going to show you the results from 2 different areas that we looked at. One being a warm mesic site, one being a cool wet site. And what we're looking at here is Norway spruce biomass in dark gray, other tree species in light gray. The amount of forest damage due to wind throw in blue, and the amount of damage due to bark beetles in red. And this is under current climate conditions. So if we start with our warm mesic site, there spruce are doing great. Bark beetles are also a considerable component of the ecosystem, but they seem to be, for lack of a better word, in equilibrium with what the spruce populations are doing. They're there, they're doing about the same type of damage that you'd expect from wind throw on aggregate. In the cool wet site, you've got the wind throw still taking place, but it's simply too cool for the beetle populations to really do anything. The spruce are also constrained by just the cool temperatures. Now the question comes, if we have climate change, what's actually going to happen in the future there? Here, for the warm mesic site, we see that there's projected to be a large increase in the damage caused by the bark beetles, and what that results in is a decrease in the spruce. Now, that decrease in spruce could also be driven by the direct influence of increased temperature, decreased water availability on spruce growth as well. So, big impact, but we don't know where it's coming from. If we look at the cool wet site, their increasing temperatures actually allow the spruce to do better, so they're growing better. There is an increase in the bark beetle damage, but that damage doesn't mitigate increased growth that we actually see within the spruce itself. Now, this is good. We see the impacts projected to have increased beetle damage here, but the question that we're really interested in is whether or not we actually see a positive influence of climate change on spruce or on bark beetles in the long run, or whether it's not a negative influence. So using this type of framework, we can actually tease that apart by doing various simulations that either include current climate, no beetles, current climate with beetles, climate change, no beetles, climate change with beetles. And if we do that, we can tease apart whether or not the changes in the spruce population is being driven by the direct influence of climate change on the forest, or is it being driven by better conditions for the actual beetles to cause damage. And that, at the end of the day, we can just simply simplify it down to is it a positive response or is it a negative response. And that's what we did, what we looked at 3 different areas. I've shown you the results from the warm mesic and the cool wet, but we also did this in the warm dry. And what we found was that in the warm dry site, areas where the spruce are probably already close to their climatic boundaries, there, the influence of climate change on this bark beetle drought interaction was negative right off the bat. So even though we may expect climate change to have to make bark beetles worse, that was actually not the case in these warm dry sites. There's a negative influence, and this is just having the spruce die off before the beetles are actually causing any damage. At the warm mesic site, there the projection is that we're going to have a positive influence, and it's going to increase for about the next 100 years, and then start to taper down. Again, due to the impact of climate change on the actual forest composition. And finally, in the cool wet, they're simply a pure positive response. So the big kind of global take-home that I'd like to leave you with this is that we do need to put a considerable amount of thought into how these interactions are going to play out in a regional context. We cannot just say that under all scenarios that warmer weather, decreased precipitation, increased precipitation is going to cause an increase in pathogens. Understanding how those pathogens interact with the trees and the direct influence of climate on those trees is important. So we need to tease apart these various different drivers. The other thing that emerged from this work was that we saw, or that the projection was that there would be a switch in the drivers that are actually leading to beetle outbreaks occurring. So under current conditions in the warm mesic sites, bark beetle outbreaks are really focused around areas where there has been wind throw events. So in this landscape map here, blue areas represent where there's been a big wind throw, and you see the beetle populations in the outbreak of the beetle populations really focusing on those areas. Now because of this, foresters in the region go in there immediately after a wind throw event and try to get rid of all those trees. That's the main mechanism of keeping the beetle populations down. Under future climate change scenarios, what we see is a decoupling of the actual beetle populations from those wind throw events. So even though that was a key driver under current conditions, the expectation is that you're no longer going to need those wind throw events to have the populations jump up. So the initiation of the beetle events is going to be different. In Davos, we actually see the opposite picture. Here, wind throw events are not really important because there's not many beetles, but they're going to become more of the epicenters of beetle outbreaks in the future as the potential for beetles to reproduce in those areas.
What's the difference between Davos and Black Forest?
Sorry. Davos is cool, wet, higher elevation. It's where the beetle doesn't really do good. I should have actually put that just as cool, wet. This is cool, wet. This is the warm music. So yeah, the global take home from that is that the triggers for pathogen outbreaks may also shift in the future. Now, up to this point, everything I've been talking about really is just forest dynamics themselves, how the forest structure is going to change. What I'd like to do is shift gears a little bit now and think about what we were talking about at the beginning, forest ecosystem services. So to kind of get back to your question, yep, go ahead.
Yeah, I have one more question about, you say pathogens.
Yep.
You've talked a lot about the bark beetles, but are there other pathogens that are impacted in various ways as well?
The general statement would be yes. Most pathogens that we think of as being forest pathogens are probably going to be climate sensitive. Within the regions that I was looking at here, the bark beetles are the one that they're most concerned with. Now, that's not to say that other pathogens will not become very important in the future. But this was one that we focused on for a couple of reasons. A, it is important right now. Like I was saying, in Slovenia, it's one of their main challenges that they're facing. Also, because there's been a lot of historic research on them, getting those type of relationships between the stress level of the spruce, the age of the spruce, and the beetle susceptibility, we can draw from the actual literature because we can actually get empirical data on that. So that's the main reason we focused on this.
What other kinds of pathogens are there?
Oh, just in general.
Yeah.
Okay, well, there'll be fungal pathogens, things that are attacking roots, things that are in the soil. There's going to be a whole suite of other insect pathogens. They don't have to be bark beetles. Particularly if we're going into deciduous, there's going to be a bunch of defoliators that would be potentially important for our systems. So if we think about pathogens, that's, I guess, a very broad term. We can think about all the type of insects that get wrapped up. And they're usually the ones that historically have been focused on, again, for the reasons that they're the ones that we usually have the best data on.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah. So, going on to forest ecosystem services. And here, I guess I need to say that within Central Europe, where this work was done, you're dealing with really heavily populated areas. So the type of services that we expect from forests are probably going to be a little bit different than what we'd expect in northern BC here. But let me just run through some of the services that we were looking at. One of the most important ones was the protection that forests provide against gravitational hazards. So this would be trees blocking snow avalanches or providing protection from rockfall events. In the steep mountain valleys where you've got a lot of villages and infrastructure, that's actually the primary reason. So the foresters in the region, they want to take off some timber, but what they really want to do is make sure their forests are healthy so they're providing protection. There's obviously recreational opportunities, there's hunting opportunities, water management, biomass, we're talking about just fiber production, timber production, biodiversity maintenance. So the key thing here is that there is a range of different values that we drive from forests. Now, the question that we want to ask is, if these forests are going to change in the future, what is the impact on these various different services going to be? Or to state that another way, which forest ecosystem services are potentially at risk of future changes? Where within these landscapes are these ecosystem services at risk? And when will they possibly be positively or negatively impacted? Now, the examples that I'm going to give here are again from two areas that I've shown you before. The valley area here in southern Switzerland and the Dishma Valley up here, or Davos. So the ski area Davos is right around here. Higher elevation site going from around 1,500 meters up to 2,200 meters. The Valais site, as I mentioned before, starting off much lower, going up to about the same elevation. And the ecosystem services that we looked at were biodiversity, carbon storage, timber production, protection from gravitational hazards, and potential for having biofuel production. Now, I'm just going to show an example from a couple of those to illustrate one point. So the first thing that we're going to look at here is carbon. We can think of it as carbon storage, represented as net ecosystem exchange, but we can just kind of simplify that to say carbon storage. And what I'm showing you here is these two valley systems, the Sass Valley, which is the warm dry, the Dishma Valley, the cool wet. And I'm showing you the response, the projected response of net ecosystem exchange under 3 different climate scenarios, the A2 being one of the more extreme climate scenarios that we're looking at, +2 or RCP3PD scenario being a very mild +2 global increase in temperature. So this was actually the impetus for doing this work. We wanted to ask the question of if we are able to keep global warming to the global 2-degree increase that is talked about, what will the potential impact be under that level of warming? But a range of different services looked at here. And we're looking at 3 different elevation bands, 2,200, 1,600, and 1,000. And within each figure, the projections for the change in carbon storage is shown in the color of the climate scenario. And importantly, the gray band that is on each figure represents this historic range in which that service has been deemed acceptable. So there's been this type of variation, historic variation in carbon storage. And we use that as a way to say, if it deviates beyond this threshold, we likely will not be happy. However, if it stays within that threshold, that reflects the historic variation that we've observed in this service. Therefore, we're probably okay with it. So the big take home from this is that in most of the areas, apart from the high elevation in Dishma, that all of the climate scenarios do not have carbon flux, carbon storage moving beyond what that historic variation norm was. So yes, there's going to be impacts on these forests, but if we think about carbon storage, that's one service where it seems to be fairly robust to future climate change. Now we can contrast that to timber production. So this is potential timber production, exact same framework, and importantly, the historic variation range is also showing the exact same. So here, the gray lines, when we have deviation beyond that, we may get concerned. What you'll notice is that in the Sass Valley, to the higher elevations, there timber production is supposed to substantially increase beyond historic norms to begin with, and then later on, around 2,100, start to drop down again. At the lower elevations, project to see a decrease in timber production around 2060, again, as drought becomes more important here. But the main thing that I wanted to leave you with here, and I think what the global message should be, is that we can't assume that all forest services will respond the same to future environmental change. Some of them may show drastic changes, like timber production in this area. Others, like carbon, where as long as you have forest biomass being maintained, and you don't care what species it is, it's probably going to be fairly robust. So it depends on what service we're looking at. Okay, and just for one last section here, I want to spend a little bit of time talking about adaptive forage management and forest health and work that we did there. Now, again, this is going to be a European context, so we're really talking about heavily managed forests where the foresters are willing to go in or are able to go in, do specific management to actually maintain forests, go in when they're 40 years, 50 years old, do some thinning events to either increase growth or make the stands more resilient to various different things. Now the question that we were looking at here was in the Scots pine stands where there is projected to be increased mortality due to drought. If you put in a thinning event, would you actually increase the resilience of those stands to future drought stress? So thinning obviously decreases amount of competition for light, which is good for the forest, you can get more growth, but there's potential that thinning will also increase the amount of water available to individual trees. So going into the literature, we can get good documentation that the amount of water available per tree decreases as the number of leaves in the area increases. So we have leaf area index, high leaf area index being lots of trees, lots of leaves, sucking up a bunch of water, low leaf area index being not that much evapotranspiration taking place. So as leaf area increases, water available per individual trees decreases. Just as a tangent, if we try to make the same estimate on a stand level, so not for water available for an individual tree, but just water available in the stand, that relationship is much less clear. You go into the literature and there's some documentation that really, at a stand level, no shift in evapotranspiration as a function of leaf area index. Some where there's a positive. We actually did these simulations with both tests because we weren't sure about that, so it's taken into account that uncertainty. Now, with that aside, what we're able to do was to look at stands where the forester had gone in and did thinning events in 1966, 1974, and 1979, where they were specifically put in to draw down the stands to specific basal areas. Now, when they did that, they had observed decreases in the mortality rate of the Scots pine, with the biggest decrease being observed in the heavy thinning stands. There was a heavy, medium, and low thinning treatment put in. Biggest decrease in mortality in the heavy stands. And also, you can see an increase in basal area increment in those heavily thinned stands as well. So we were getting a response from the trees when these thinning events were put in. Nicely.
What's basal area mean?
Basal area increment, it would be the rate at which the trees are actually increasing in girth. So we can just put that, or state that otherwise as being tree growth. Tree growth was better when you took away some trees. They had more light and potentially had more water. Those thinning treatments were done again in 2010, and when they did them at that point, they actually had soil moisture measures in the ground. So they were to see how soil moisture was impacted by these thinning treatments. And there they found that in the heavy thinning treatment, you had the most soil moisture being maintained. So it was doing what we kind of hope it to do, more moisture being available. Now on the left side here, this is all the empirical data. On the right side is how we actually incorporate it into the simulation model. For time reasons, I'm actually not going to step through that, but basically we were able to capture the shifts in basal area, showing basically the same responses as the empirical data. Importantly, the mortality rates showed the same type of fluctuations, and very importantly, this change in the soil moisture availability was also captured within the simulation model. Here, this is just a static picture because it was the one measurement in 2010, but in the model, we see the same basic responses being maintained for about 20 to 30 years. So, hopefully we're capturing the dynamics that we want there appropriately, and what we then did was ask the question of, in a future changing, under future climate change, can things be used as a way to mitigate the negative impacts of climate change on some of these stands? Now, I'll just show you kind of one snapshot or one example of this. So this would be a forest that's at an intermediate elevation under current conditions dominated by Norway spruce with a little bit of larch as well. And that under a control scenario, no thinning, intermediate climate change scenario, we get to the same type of response that we saw in some of the previous figures, where around 2050 to 2100, there is projected to be a strong dieback of the Norway spruce being replaced by more drought-tolerant deciduous species. Now, the question is, can we mitigate some of that negative impact with thinning? So that's what we simulated, thinning in the low, medium, or high variety at 2050. And what we did observe, or what the projection was that there is going to be a decrease in mortality of the spruce right after those thinning events. So we can keep those spruce alive for a little bit longer. That's great, that's what we want to do. However, if we look at mortality of the remaining spruce about 20 to 50 to 40 years after that, you have to see the projected mortality going above what the actual control level would be. So the main thing that I want you to take away from this is that putting in these modified management, adaptive management, can be good. We were seeing basically what we wanted to see in the short term. But there needs to be some thought about what the long-term implications for modified management will be for the development of these stands. Okay? Now, just very quickly here, everything I'll be talking about has been Central European. And what I mentioned is, can we actually wrap up any of this into lessons or some general take-homes for northern subboreal boreal forests? Very generally, I think there's some things that we can take away from it. First being that we need to be thoughtful about what type of processes are going to be climate sensitive. Are these things that will drive forest dynamics? What are those things that are going to be driving forest dynamics? Secondly, we need to be cognizant of the fact that we will expect to see regional differences in forest responses. And not only in terms of the sensitivity of the forest to climate change or the magnitude, but to my mind, one of the most important things is the timing. When may we expect to see shifts in the forest under different climate scenarios? Interactions between the direct and indirect impacts with the mountain pine beetle outbreak over the past decades, past 20 years here. This is something where we're probably more aware of it in BC than many other places, but we really need to keep into mind how those direct and indirect impacts are going to play themselves out. With respect to the multifunctionality or the various different range of ecosystem services that we derive from forests, we need to keep in mind that they're going to show different responses as well. Again, we can't just put on a blanket statement that forests are going to change and therefore all the services are going to be negatively or positively influenced. It really will likely depend on the service that you're looking at. And lastly, adaptive management can be good. It can be something that we want to implement, but we should think about what the long-term impacts of some of that adaptive management may be. Now, there's other challenges that we obviously need to be considering when we're thinking about what the actual drivers of forest dynamics are. Maybe I'll just leave that up there for a second and not go into it in detail because we're of the time. And at this stage, open up to any thoughts, questions that you have.
What effect would replanting a harvested section with a monoculture have on all this? Like we do typically plant just one species after we've gone through clear cutting.
Yeah. So at least within the Swiss context and for actually large parts of Europe, clear cuts aren't really considered as a management option right now. They're done in probably smaller scales, but larger scale clear cuts aren't done. And what I'd say is that if you do a clear cut and a replanting that results in an even age stand, you're potentially opening yourself up to a risk of having some of these negative impacts really result in a collapse of that whole stand at one point in time. By having a mixed stand where you've got multiple species, and you're in some ways just building in inherent resilience to changes that you'd see in the future. Now, this obviously comes into a trade-off. If you're just trying to maximize growth over the short term under a fairly secure future, yes, having a monoculture that you can actually quite clearly project how it's going to change in the future may be a benefit. If you want to take into account some of the uncertainty about what the future climate's going to be, what future pest disturbances are going to be, that may not be the most appropriate response. So it's how you weight those two options, I guess.
Is there any evidence that any of these species are actually evolving to some degree to meet the changes?
Yes. Now, I can't actually speak to any of these species in particular, but just knowing of other research that's going on, there is shifts in when species would bud out with respect to the spring. So yeah, there is going to be plasticity within all biological organisms that can kind of mitigate these impacts. That is something that we really haven't looked enough at, and I think is one of the key areas where future research really needs to focus on. How much will Scots pine, Norway spruce be able to modify its growth in response to decreases in water availability or to increases in temperature? So, yeah, the answer is it's important, but we don't know enough about it. There's some great work being done on it, but we don't know enough, would be my response.
I'll just add to that, though, and that is that we tend to think of these species as neat packages of ecological traits, but in fact, if you populated your model with Norway spruce from Finland versus Norway spruce from Bulgaria, there's enough genetic variation there that you get quite different results.
Well, most definitely.
So I know at least in BC, they're talking about not necessarily facilitating the movement of, Oregon and Washington species up here, but just moving the seed lots around, from some of the more southern or drought tolerant populations into our part of the world.
Okay.
So there's a lot of subspecies variability there that's yet to be understood and mined for its information content.
Yeah, so if we think about ways that we can actually actively try to mitigate climate, one would be moving around species, but as you're mentioning there, you can actually just think about moving around individuals that are adapted to different conditions as a way of mitigating that as well. That should be the first thing we're going to do.
You look at rusts at all? Because just thinking about some of the local issues we have here, like Dropperstone,
Yeah.
where you have a moist climate, and if you shift that over to a warmer climate, it's going to with less moisture, potentially your Dropperstone won't be as felt, right?
Yeah, that's an extremely good point, and kind of goes into the statement that we really need to think about the interactions between the disturbances or the pathogens and the direct climate responses. So yeah, did we look at it in terms of any of our work? No, not at all. Kind of repeating what I said before, it was just beetles because we had good data on the beetles, and that's what was projected to be the main influence in the future. But do I think that it should be looked at? Yes. Those type of issues with rust are going to be important, and it's something that you need to think about when you're doing the transplants that you're talking about there. You may get the tree responding one way, but the rust and the other pathogens may respond another way.
If we have no further questions, please join me in thanking Dr. Elkin for his presentation. And we have a small gift to welcome to the UNBC family so that he can take up his office in Prince George with a